My name is Fiona Stewart and I'm one of the authors of the OECD paper on pension funds and the role they can play in financing green growth initiatives. Now, it's widely accepted that large amounts of capital are going to be required over the next 2 decades to fund climate change and mitigation. For example, the UN have committed to raising $100 billion in their climate change fund. And it's also accepted that a lot of this financing is going to have to come not just from the public sector but also from private sector capital. Now, pension funds with their $28 trillion in assets worldwide are a very obvious source of this capital, particularly as many of these funds are looking for diversified, long-term investments with stable and inflation-protected income. It would seem to be a win-win situation in that many of the renewable energy and other infrastructure type products would fit the pension funds portfolios very well. However, we're only seeing pension funds allocate to these type of investments very slowly at the moment. That's for several reasons. Partly as the environmental and long-term policy framework is not necessarily clear. We don't necessarily have very clear indications on pricing for climate change, pricing for carbon. And also some of the policies related to the renewable energies, some of the subsidies have been changing, so it's very hard for pension funds to make long-term investments in this field. There's also a lack of suitable financing vehicles available which pension funds can get into these type of investments. And finally, there's also needs to be much more knowledge and education done, both in terms of the pension funds and in terms of the regulators indeed, to try and encourage the scale and increase of investments that we'll need. In our paper we look at some initiatives that are underway around the world to try and get the pension funds and get the scale needed to meet these challenges through groups like the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, the P8 Group, which is a major group of pension funds globally who've come together to try and get more involvement and more investment in this space. And we also look at some of the interesting financing mechanisms that are out there. For example, the green bonds that have been issued by the World Bank and other authorities, and also some of the interesting structured finance mechanisms coming out of Europe. And finally, in the paper we make some policy recommendations about how to improve the policy, the environmental policy, the infrastructure background, how to get some of these better risk-return financing mechanisms in place for pension funds, and some of the education initiatives that are necessary. So we hope you find the report useful, and we'd very much like to hear from you and a range of stakeholders on how we can very much take this dialogue forward and get the financing we need to meet the climate change challenges that will be ahead of us in the next 2 decades.